we don't have any microphones or anything, so we'll just have to do our best. It's great to see such a fantastic turnout. And so welcome everybody to the Kerlin Gallery, and thanks to the Kerlin Gallery for inviting me and for Willie to being open to doing this today. We're here to talk with Willie Doherty about this exhibition Remains, and this piece of work and accompanying work that formed that exhibition. At the end of last year, there was an exhibition in Derry called Unseen, a series of works by Willie Doherty that included this film Remains, and it was really an extraordinary highlight of last year for me. A really astonishing exhibition. The first time Willie had such a substantial survey of his work in Derry, and within that exhibition, a highlight again was the film Remains. And if you haven't seen it yet, you'll get a chance to see it tonight. So we talk about that, and we talk about some of the related work. As people are settling themselves, I'll just also say that I'm going to ask a few things, maybe not all that much, because there's quite a lot of people here. I can see looking around the room just how intelligent all of you are. So hopefully you'll
go easy.
Yeah, hopefully you'll ask penetrating but generous questions, if you see what I mean. No crazy stuff tonight. So thanks, Willie, for talking with us. I suppose maybe the first thing to ask about is maybe to introduce the film of Remains a little bit and tell us about the background of that film.
Okay. Well, I suppose it comes out of a number of works that I've been making over the last number of years, really, since, I guess, maybe Ghost Story in 2007. And particularly it came out of a collaboration with the author Susan McKay, who will probably be along here later tonight. Susan and I were asked to make a collaboration for the Field Day Review, this edition of it, which was going to be a kind of special edition for the Derry City of Culture year. So we both agreed to do it because we'd kind of met each other over the last number of years. I was anxious to kind of talk to Susan and meet her because of the journalism that she's done over the years, but also particularly a book that she made called Bear in Mind These Dead, which is a kind of an attempt to account for or kind of deal with many of the people who were kind of left behind or kind of forgotten as part of the peace process in the North, and the desire to kind of move forward. It always kind of struck me when I kind of thought about that whole process, that part of what we were asked to do in order to kind of secure this peace was to kind of forget about the past to some extent, but not in a kind of productive or constructive way, but almost in I suppose in the kind of typical let's sweep it under the carpet kind of way and pretend it didn't happen, And I think in the absence of any kind of real structures that weren't put in place to deal with the past, there always seemed to be this kind of unspoken kind of legacy, if you want, or this kind of irritation somewhere in the background about the past, And Susan has written really beautifully about that, I think, in this book. And it was certainly something that I was concerned about in Ghost Story and a number of works that I've made since that. And I suppose that the more people say, why don't you just kind of forget about it and move on, the more kind of stubborn it makes me to kind of say, well, actually there's still a lot of things that, I think about in relation to what happened in the north of Ireland, and I'm sure a lot of other people think about them as well. So it seemed to me that there was kind of something there kind of worth thinking about it. And I suppose in a broader sense, I do feel that the artist and maybe the arts in general do have a contribution to make in terms of dealing with issues of the past or dealing with trauma or reimagining what the future might be in a kind of post-conflict society. So I think this body of work is an attempt to actualize that in some way, you know, which is a kind of, I don't know if it's a kind of a wise thing to do or not, but it just seems to me that as someone who lives there, to ignore it seems to be like the worst thing to do, you know. And you know, and I suppose in the last year or so, in relation to all of the kind of flags protests that have happened in Belfast and the ongoing conflicts and sectarian tension around parades, and then the kind of failure of the Haas talks, where there wasn't any possibility of reaching a kind of consensus about how we could move forward politically out of that stalemate. It just seems more kind of pressing than ever that we find the kind of mechanism or the language to kind of talk about this stuff. I don't know if deal with it is the right thing, but certainly to talk about it seems to me potentially productive.
And the way art does that, and the way your films and photographs do that, is obviously different from how the news media will do that, or how even Susan McKay's journalism might perhaps do it.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And in Remains, you tell a series of stories that are part of this process of stubbornly remembering or making visible things that people don't want to talk about. What was it about the particular stories that are told that you felt needed to be addressed in some way?
Well, I mean, I actually made these photographs in January last year, so about a year ago, and then I think we shot the video in April or something of last year, so it was a few months after I made quite a lot of photographs, you know, that became part of this project, that I finally kind of decided that there was a video work in there to be made. And when Susan and I kind of met up initially, one of the things that we were kind of interested in was kind of teenagers in Derry, you know, and what that's like, you know, both from the people who you see kind of, I suppose, in a more kind of optimistic way or kind of high-spirited way, kind of hanging around the town, as I say, in Derry and along the walls. The guys who are kind of stuck in kind of peripheral kind of housing estates. So there were a couple of stories that Susan was kind of interested in thinking about, which were all kind of related to these kind of housing estates where there's like huge levels of unemployment, and it seemed that, you know, the possibility of what the City of Culture might bring was kind of just passing that by. So we met several kind of gangs of teenagers who hang around the back of this set of shops, and that's one of the stories that kind of Susan deals with here. But I suppose it was through kind of meeting these guys and hearing them kind of talk about their lives in a particular kind of way that it reminded me of being a teenager and hanging around other corners in Derry in a kind of fairly unproductive kind of way. So I suppose that the idea of this, I suppose a kind of trilogy of kind of stories related to kind of kneecapping in one way or another, or kind of punishment beatings, came out of that, because one of the things that these guys talked about was, you know, their kind of fear of RAD, which was this organisation was set up, you know, that it was kind of self-appointed dissident Republican organisation that was set up in Derry over 2 or 3 years ago, called Republican Action Against Drugs. So they were the bane of these teenagers' lives, you know, and many of their friends have been kind of beaten up and kind of, you know, actually told to kind of get out of town, basically. And you can see some of the RAD graffiti on the back of this wall where they were hanging out. And it kind of reminded me of this similar kind of experience or kind of fear that I had when I was a teenager. So the first story in this kind of trilogy is, I suppose, an autobiographical element in the work. And then the other two, well, the middle one is it really kind of relates to this location, which is again the back of a set of shops in the Craigan Estate in Derry, which has again been used since the 1980s for kneecappings and other kind of punishment. beatings.
Amazing that continues in a way that...
Well, I mean, I suppose that was the thing that really kind of struck me, because there was another event then that happened in 2012, where there was members of a very well-known Republican family in Derry were basically forced to bring... There was one guy who was forced to bring his son and his nephew along at a prearranged time for kneecapping, which they did, and there were a couple of cases of that. It just seemed to me kind of extraordinary that, that these things were kind of like prearranged and someone would have to bring their child along to be shot in the knees, but also just the kind of cyclical nature of some of that violence and the kind of intergenerational nature of it, which is in one way is a kind of depressing kind of outlook, but so I mean in a way that's kind of where this work came from. It came out of initially talking with these teenagers and then kind of thinking about some of the other events that had happened around this kind of spate of punishment beatings and punishment shootings that happened in the last couple of years. And then just, realising that, that aspect of the way in which nationalist areas are policed within Derry and probably also kind of Belfast hasn't really changed over the years, and hasn't really benefited from the peace process. And it's kind of, Susan and I were kind of laughing at one point. I mean, thinking that we were going to make the most kind of depressing contribution to this publication, and maybe we did, but I think there are some kind of glimmers of hope in what we did and what Susan wrote about. But generally, that's kind of how this work came about. But obviously, when you start making the work, then it kind of takes on a life of its own, And I think a lot of the work that I make, I mean, and again, this is maybe a kind of more kind of general statement. It often starts off with a particular location or particular place that I'm kind of interested in for a particular reason, or maybe I don't even know what the reason is, and then the work evolves and somehow it takes on its own kind of life, and it was only kind of afterwards when I kind of I suppose when I was kind of writing the script or the text of this piece, which I did after we shot the footage, that I kind of started to realise that there were these kind of vague religious overtones in it, this idea of a kind of trinity of horrible stories, and also this kind of relationship between kind of fathers and sons, and as I say, a kind of a generational thing that these events happened over a period of like 20, 25 years, something like that. So that was something that kind of surprised me in a way, that element of it came out, because I have a very kind of loose way of kind of structuring these things, and then the other part of it then was this kind of image of the burning car, and I guess that's I kind of referenced the kind of some of the images that were prevalent in an early phase of this body of work. There was a period around 93, 94 when I started making the large colour Cibachrome works, that I photographed a number of cars that I'd kind of discovered burnt out along the border between Derry and Donegal. So this was a kind of reference back to that, but also the first kind of couple of lines of this work reference the idea of a dream, that it's kind of like a dream. So this image of the car is it functions almost like a kind of a dreamlike image within the work, and it's a kind of device that separates the three stories. So it kind of looms up as this kind of like, almost like a kind of bit of a traumatic kind of throwback or kind of nightmare image from the past.
Your filmmaking style often has that sense of a dreamlike quality, in that we'll approach something and we're almost always moving, drifting in a slightly unreal way. But you'll approach something and then it might, disappear from view. We can never quite make contact with the thing that we're, approaching or seeing.
I mean, and I guess there's a similar quality in this work as well. I mean, one of the other things that I'm kind of interested in is a kind of relationship between sort of documentary practices and fiction, if you want. So I kind of use the camera to almost kind of explore these places in a forensic way, so that the camera really just kind of moves through these spaces. But the voiceover then kind of takes you somewhere else. So you've got this, while you're kind of looking at the kind of reality of the kind of the dirt on the ground, the kind of grubbiness, the physical nature of the place. The voiceover is kind of put in another kind of layer or another kind of narrative on it. So there's these two kind of parallel kind of narratives, if you want, to run through the thing. One is what the visual kind of narrative of a description of the places, but then this other, fictional narrative. And even though they come from kind of actual events, I tend to think of them as being a work of fiction, really, than nothing really to do with kind of documentary as such,
The voiceover in this film is done by Adrian Dunbar.
Yeah.
And there's been other powerful voiceovers by Kenneth Branagh, Stephen Ray, and other films. Is there a particular thing you ask for when you're, talking to the actors about how they approach these voiceovers?
Well, I mean, often it's just a kind of, initially what attracts me to someone is just the kind of sound of the voice or the tone of the voice, And Adrian Dunbar, he strikes me as, I mean, a lot of the characters he plays are often these kind of slightly dodgy guys, So he has this kind of edge where he's, even in, I don't know if anybody recently saw Good Vibrations. He had this kind of strange part in that where he played a kind of a paramilitary kind of yob with very long hair. He looked very weird in it, So I think it was something about the way he's often characterized as being, he's kind of a middle-aged guy now, but he has this, I associate him with, a slightly shady character as well, So that's part of the reason why I asked him. I didn't tell him that, but he agreed to do it, which was great.
Yeah.
And I met him in Belfast, and we kind of recorded the thing on the same day. So we just kind of met up. We had a coffee, had a chat, and then we went to the recording studio, and he did it. So we were there probably 2 or 3 hours, and it was just really a process of him trying to kind of get a sense of what I wanted, who this character kind of might be, and also his own kind of understanding of some of those stories and some of those kind of histories. Because I think he's very kind of engaged with kind of politics in the north, and also this year, as part of the City of Culture in Derry, he'd done this thing where he kind of produced all of Brian Freed's plays and showed them over the period of about a couple of months in Derry. So I saw a couple of them, including a production of translations that he did, which was really fantastic, actually, So it was great that he agreed to do it.
One of the things that leads us to is the context in which, not the only context, but one of the contexts in which this work was seen, which was the Unseen exhibition, Unseen being the title, in Derry. And of course, these locations, that set of stories, have a resonance there, which is no doubt different. Or slightly different, maybe even very different to what might happen elsewhere. And what was your sense of that? There, were there different responses, or did you have different sensations or thoughts about it being in Derry?
Well, I mean, it was great to do in Derry. I mean, I really enjoyed the whole experience of showing the work there, and I had a great response, But one of the things that happens if you show photographs of a place where the audience is familiar with that place is that people have this kind of anecdotal relationship with the places, so they kind of, I know that place, or I know those shops, or, you know, my granny lives around that corner, or, you know, so I had a lot of that. People tell me that, you know, how they knew these places and their particular kind of memories or associations with them, which you don't really get if you show the work somewhere else. I mean, it might very occasionally happen somewhere like Dublin, you know. So that was really kind of interesting, because there was a kind of an unspoken shorthand between some of the things, or my understanding of those places and the kind of local audience's understanding. There was a good degree of kind of crossover. Now, I don't anticipate that would be the same when I show the work in Dublin or elsewhere. And I think a lot of these images are, although they are very specific places, they're also kind of quite generic. So, you know, you don't have to know too much about the specifics of Derry to know that these are two kind of quite dodgy looking places, you know. And I'm sure everybody knows kind of similarly dodgy looking places in Dublin and in other cities. So in that sense, they have a kind of generic quality, you know. And that's fine, because that, you know, that allows the kind of audience from wherever to kind of go with the work and to kind of understand, you know, almost without me having to do too much what these kind of places are about, you know. So the work has always had that kind of relationship between the very specific and the very local, and then having to kind of find a way of negotiating with and kind of finding other audiences, you know. And one of the kind of interesting things about showing some of the very early work in the show is that I kind of realised that some of that really early work was so specific to Derry that you almost needed to kind of have a history book in one hand and a geography or book or an atlas in the other hand, you know. Which makes me wonder why anyone ever wanted to show it in the first place, you know, because it was so kind of specific, you know.
I was writing a little while ago about some of those early photographs for the show in New York, and my dad, who's from Derry, was looking at them with me and pointing out some of the things, but what was on the other side of a wall or a fence, or what was in relation to what. And it was kind of eye-opening to have that sense of it. But equally, there was always this sense of demarcation, constraint, obscured view, or whatever that could be universal. Maybe you could say something, given the nature and structure of the show here, about the two practices that are here, the photography and the video. Insofar as, you know, there are things here, there's a shot of that setting in the video, and yet these are different parts of your artistic life, in a way related but distinct. You know, you approach them differently. Could you talk about how you undertake the process of making photographs?
Well, I suppose the way in which I've been thinking about the photographs recently is more kind of related to a kind of documentary practice. You know, these were like photographs of very particular places, and I was in some ways kind of responding to some of the first drafts of the text that Susan was writing, but also some of the places that we kind of visited, you know, because, you know, basically what we did, we went and met various people in various places, and kind of heard their stories, and Susan kind of interviewed them, and she said quite a kind of light touch. And I just kind of went along to listen. I didn't really do anything. I didn't take any photographs, or because I told her I didn't want to photograph any of these kind of teenagers or any of these other people who we were talking to, you know. I said I would just prefer to kind of see the places where their lives were kind of lived out, and then I would maybe think about doing something there. So the whole thing was kind of quite tenuous in a way at one point. But anyway, over a week or so in January of last year, where the weather was absolutely terrible, I went back and started photographing some of these places, you know. And some of the other images are accompany the text in the book. So the few that I kind of chose to accompany the video are images that don't appear in the book, you know. Really, because I just wanted to kind of keep that kind of separation. So, but you can see that, you know, these images were made in a way to kind of accompany an article. So in a way, they were kind of illustrations for the article. You know, they don't directly kind of illustrate it, but, you know, you can read you can read them alongside the text very easily, you know. So I had the images first, and that was the kind of function of the images, you know. And as I say, it was only after a few months that I kind of started thinking about making a video in these same locations. And then I started thinking about it in a completely different way. Then it becomes more about these other kinds of stories and this kind of fictional character who kind of talks across these kind of generations, if you want. Then I stopped thinking about it really in terms of a kind of documentary type practice, but it kind of shifts into another kind of gear, or another kind of mode of working, you know.
And when you take, say, either of these photographs here, they're typical in one sense of your work, in that there's a real formal rigor to them, you know. I mean, but are there particular kinds of parameters? Maybe you don't want to reveal your secrets in this way, you know, else we'll all be like making our own Willie Dohertys. But what works for you when you take a photograph?
Well, I suppose there is a kind of a formal quality to these. I mean, they're usually kind of quite frontal. I mean, I wasn't really trying to kind of do anything particular fancy. You know, I'm really just kind of describing these places, you know, photographically. So I tended to kind of pick the ones that were kind of most kind of straightforward, you know.
Does this mean in a way that, you know, to think in terms of documentary, or to think in things that are a little more straightforward, that the conditions for documentary are a lot different now than they were when you started? The documentary, maybe in relation to this subject matter, has an entirely different kind of value.
Well, I think it does. I mean, I've always kind of had a fairly troubled relationship with documentary practices, you know. Really, not because I don't enjoy looking at photographs and looking at other artists and other photographers' photographs. I mean, I do. But I suppose what really concerned me always was the fact that a documentary practice seemed to kind of lack a kind of a self-reflexive mechanism. That there was a kind of an acceptance that this was of kind of value, and it had to happen in a particular kind of way, and the role of the photographer or the artist couldn't be questioned in a way. And I just find that really problematic, you know, because there's so many kind of variables. So I suppose, I mean, I always kind of present my kind of images slightly self-consciously, you know. And I wouldn't, you know, loudly proclaim their kind of documentary value. I mean, they are extremely partial. Someone else would come along to the same place and make a very different kind of photograph, you know. I mean, I suppose I was more kind of interested in the kind of architectural subject and the way in which fences and railings and bits of barbed wire and stuff get kind of left behind in these spaces. And the kind of story that tells, which again is something that I kind of pick up on in the video, that the way in which the camera kind of moves through these spaces tells a kind of story of the kind of spaces these are, and how they're used, and what kind of happens there. So I was kind of interested in that aspect of them. But beyond that, you know, I don't have they have no kind of bigger claims, you know.
Yeah. Because they still, I suppose, to some extent, you know, withdraw from documentary too, you know, or don't claim any particular authority, you know, in terms of picturing. It's what's not there is obviously as important as what's there. And the project with Susan is very much about, in a way, the things that can't be found or seen.
Yeah,
or, you know.
I mean, I only decided to print some of the photographs after I made the video. I probably wouldn't have, if I hadn't made the video, I probably wouldn't have made these photographs to sit alongside it. I would have been happy just to kind of let them function in the way they do alongside Susan's text. And that would have been fine, because it was an interesting project to do, you know. But it was only after I kind of made the video work that I kind of started thinking about how some of these images could then begin to sit alongside it, because the expectation is that the viewer who comes to look at these photographs will also look at that. So that story then kind of feeds back into how you then begin to read and understand these images. So they kind of cross-contaminate each other in a way. So the story that you kind of hear in the video will invariably impact on how you look at and think about the photographs. So in a way they become part of that fiction. And their documentary status then becomes kind of diminished, if you want. So I was kind of happy about that they would, their status as kind of standalone photographs would be kind of diminished by their association with this video work.
There's always one thing and another thing. We can never see any one thing in isolation, which is really a consistent tendency in your work.
Sure, yeah.
Thanks everybody for the contributions, but particularly I'd like to all please to thank Willie Doherty.